Preseason news and notes, ADP battles, and our three favorite NBA win total over-under bets. That's all coming up next on the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Welcome into the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball Pod. It is Wednesday, October 11th. Nick Whalen back with Brandon Kravitz. Brandon will be doing this pod every Wednesday from now through the end of the regular season. A ton to get to today. We had a huge NBA preseason slate last night. We had NBA teams playing against what I thought were soccer teams. We had the Wizards playing some team I had never heard of. The Blazers are playing the New Zealand Breakers in the late window. They end up winning that game by 40. We won't go in depth. We're not going to jump from box score to box score, but we want to hit some of the big picture items from last night. After that, we'll talk about our favorite win total bets for the season. And then Brandon's got some ADP battles lined up. So we'll talk about some players who are going in similar ranges, discuss the pros, the cons of each, and which player we ultimately prefer. Brandon, where do you want to go first here? Do we need to start in Orlando?
Yeah. I mean, of course, one eye on that last night. It was a busy night in sports on a Tuesday night. You had all this baseball. My Baltimore Orioles got eliminated after winning 0 games in the postseason, but I won't bore all of you with that.
The Brewers are right there with them, right? And, I think maybe we should take a moment of silence here for our guy, John McKechnie, who had a rough weekend with the Ravens. And then, this is not what we wanted to see from the O's.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. McKechnie's hardcore, so I know that he's definitely reeling today. But certainly, even with that going on, one eye on the Magic and their win last night. So that's always good to see, even though it's meaningless in the preseason. In terms of any sort of grand takeaways, I mean, the team kind of was what I expected them to be. You saw, if you want to start with the rookies, Anthony Black, his shot does not look good.
No, it does not.
That's just not something that's going to all of a sudden snap of a finger correct itself this season, but it should be something that they clearly need to work on when they get to a true off season next year. And you just hope that he can contribute in other ways. I thought he looked really comfortable on the defensive end. So that's something that he should be able to hang his hat on. Defense and playmaking, and that's all they really need him to do. They've got guys like Karl-Anthony that can score off the bench, and Jett Howard. I don't know how many minutes he's going to get, but I was somebody that was really down on the pick at the time. I even sort of told him that at media day, which created an awkward moment. But I get locked into these mock drafts. There wasn't a single one that had Jett Howard going 11. Mm-hmm. And so I was shocked by the pick. Man, that guy looks like he's ready for the NBA, though. I mean, he just looks the part. I don't know what kind of minutes he gets, but he looks like he can do it.
Yeah, I think he's always had more of an NBA-style game, right? And there are some players that you watch at the college level and you just think, okay, you look good here. There's a reason we're talking about you as a lottery pick, but the spacing, the pace, the differences in shot selection, the differences in coaching in the NBA just suit certain players better. And I think Jett Howard is one of those guys. There's some clips going around of Paolo Banchero last night. I thought he looked great, looked really explosive, had a big fast break dunk. Markelle Fultz, same thing. Fultz, by the way, I don't think I've ever seen him actually palm the ball or use two hands. He's the only player in the league that scoops the ball on its way up every time he dunks. But he looked great last night. 10 points for Fultz in 20 minutes, 5 of 7 from the field. Jalen Suggs started alongside Markelle Fultz with Banchero, Franz Wagner, and Wendell Carter Jr. I think this is probably the default starting lineup, right? Am I missing something here? I mean, does Gary Harris, does he kind of have the incumbent role over Jalen Suggs? We did see him work off the bench last night for 15 minutes.
Yeah, that was the big talking point once the starting 5 was released last night here locally. For those that don't know, I do live in the city of Orlando and cover the Magic extensively. That the fact that Gary Harris was the starter in that spot last year, I think they want Jalen Suggs to be the starter. This is part of the value of the preseason, is I do think they're going to take a couple of games to figure out if Jalen Suggs is right for that role. The reason why he would be, though, I mean, you're talking about another guy you need to see an offensive leap from, and we saw no sign of that last night. 1 of 5 from three-point range, rough around the edges in terms of his offensive game. Which is the issue that you've had with him. But he doesn't really need to be the scorer. Paolo and Franz, and especially if Wendell is going to be as efficient as he was last night, you don't need him to be that guy. I know that the 2 position is technically a shooting guard, but I think at this point in 2023, we're all sort of off of that. You don't have to have everyone on the floor. Doesn't need to be Steph Curry. So I do think there's a lane where he is the starter because of what he brings on defense, and they're just not going to expect a lot from him on the offensive end.
I think you want him to be the starter if you're Orlando, right? I mean, that was the goal, right? Like I if they want to try to win as many games as they can from the jump, then yeah, maybe you start with Gary Harris and you hope that eventually Jalen Suggs does enough to take that role. But you didn't draft Jalen Suggs with the hope that he's your 7th man, So I think there is some, there's kind of some institutional push, within that organization to probably try to at least give Jalen Suggs one last chance here. Without getting injured. It feels like every time he's taken a step forward, an injury has popped up and then he's kind of back to square one. Jonathan Isaac, this will be the last Orlando Magic note before we move on to the Pelicans side of things and then hit some of these other games. Jonathan Isaac played basketball, Brandon. He played 8 minutes. He did not get hurt. He had 2 blocks. He had a steal. We saw a couple plays where you're like, okay, that's why this guy was in the Defensive Player of the Year conversation like 4 years ago. Are we still, you know a lot more about the Magic than I do. Is the feel around Jonathan Isaac that anything you get from him is a bonus? Are there any real expectations among Magic fans?
No, none. The idea is it's gravy, and just to see him out there playing basketball, that's the plus. I mean, you already hit on all of the check marks that we needed to see from Jonathan Isaac. The fact that he was active in the first preseason game and they didn't feel like they had to treat him with kid gloves and hold him out. The fact that he played whatever allotment of minutes he had last night, 8, and didn't get hurt. Those are the things that you're looking for. He can be a positive contribution because when he's at his best, he's better than most players that you look at as a clear second option or in terms of just being part of that second unit. So he can really help bolster. Usually when teams go to their bench, they lose a lot of defense, and that's where teams can kind of catch up if they have a deficit. Jonathan Isaac brings it on defense more than most guys that you're bringing off the bench in the NBA. And so that's the benefit there. I also think that his presence is part of the reason why you kind of have to have Jalen Suggs in the starting lineup. If Jalen Suggs, Jonathan Isaac, and Anthony Black are on the floor together as part of that second unit, you have no scoring. So that it's all sort of, making the puzzle pieces fit.
Yeah, kind of a Pittsburgh Steelers, like Matt Canada offense approach with those 3 guys on the floor. On the other side of this one, Zion Williamson, first game back in a while for the Pelicans. You look like he dropped some weight, looked a little bit more explosive, started 0 for 2 from the field, had a couple of turnovers. It wasn't a fantastic night for Zion, but had a nice run, towards the end of the first quarter, early second quarter, where he converted an and one on the baseline, started to impose his will physically. 5 assists for Zion. That to me is what stands out. Like we know he's going to get the points. He's going to get the rebounds. He had 12 points, 5 boards in 15 minutes. He's going to be playing 30 to 35 minutes a night when healthy. Points and rebounds, that's a given. What he could give you in terms of assists, in terms of steals, in terms of blocks, and then what his free throw percentage ultimately settles at, like that's really all that matters with Zion when it comes to fantasy. I think he's one of those guys where there's a bit of a disconnect, even when he's healthy and even when he's playing well. He's not someone to me that has top 10 fantasy potential, just because the defensive stats in particular have not translated since the college level. So I'm very interested to see, hopefully we get a month plus of Zion healthy to begin the year. Like, what is he doing in addition to scoring and rebounding?
Yeah, I mean, that's been the holdup outside of the obvious health issues with Zion Williamson. I think that he does profile as somebody that can be a great playmaker. We saw that a lot at Duke, and I think when he's hit the floor in the NBA, he's just trying to find his space. The fact that the Pelicans have been able to win games to some degree without Zion allows them to reinsert Zion and say, this is now how you can help this team win games. And I think that certainly creating some attention for himself on offense, second chance opportunities with offensive rebounds, that's how he ends up making himself valuable on a team that is really used to playing basketball without him.
Okay, let's hit a few quick notes from these other games. We had Bucks-Grizzlies last night. Still no Dame, no Lillard. Those are the same guy. No Dame, no Giannis, no Chris Middleton.
Both of them out.
Yeah, Dame and Lillard were both out. I'm really high on their second year guy. I guess technically a wing, Marion Beauchamp. Didn't look great last night. 2 of 11 from the field, 1 of 6 from 3. I've been saying all along they kind of need him to be their Jordan Poole, and they're very different players. Like you don't necessarily want him coming in and jacking up 25 shots, but they need that that young late first round pick type of guy to rejuvenate what's ultimately an aging core for Milwaukee. So that's somebody I'm going to be watching pretty closely during the preseason. We saw Brook Lopez get some action. We saw Bobby Portis, Jay Crowder, Campaign made his debut. Malik Beasley played 22 minutes as well. No major takeaways for me on the Milwaukee side. On the Memphis side, Jared Jackson looked great in 24 minutes, 17 points, 5 rebounds, 3 blocks. I was talking with Alex on Monday. Both Jackson and Desmond Bane, I think, are still maybe a little undervalued. And, Jackson's getting pushed up draft board, so maybe not him quite as much. But, I think one of the side effects of this Ja Morant suspension is we're going to see, significant jacked up usage for both of those guys for the first 30% of the season.
Oh, big time. That's why Desmond Bane seems to be getting pushed up boards left and right, and I think deservedly so. The guy is super efficient from three-point range, and he's a really confident basketball player. So where else are they going to generate offense from? He's definitely going to be their number one guy in that regard. And then, he still has a role when Ja Morant comes back into the lineup too, so it's not like he's just going to fade into the background. I love whenever we get Kenny Lofton Jr. minutes. That's personally what I look for whenever Memphis hits the floor in the preseason. Preseason Summer League champ.
Yeah, well, every time Kenneth Lofton's on the floor, whether it's in the NBA or in the G League, he puts up numbers. There's no question about that. He took 10 shots in 25 minutes, took 5 threes for some reason last night. He will get numbers. They might not always be positive numbers, but he's not afraid to shoot the ball. I want to talk a little Johnny Davis, not because I just want to foist some Wisconsin Badgers talk on you. Not a ton of takeaways from the Wizards playing the Cairns Taipans. I don't even know where that is, what league they're a part of. I don't their logo appears to be a snake, possibly. Johnny Davis,
definitely a snake.
Okay, yeah, it's hard to say. It's a little cut off on ESPN. Did you see Johnny Davis's shot yesterday?
I did not. I totally missed that. That one slipped through the cracks for me.
I don't know what happened. He's shooting like Markelle Fultz. There was a clip going around of him catch and shoot wide open, kind of between the wing and the corner. Nobody around him, and he moved the ball from in front of his head to the side, long, kind of push shot. It looked very Fultz-like. I know he didn't shoot the ball well last year. That was a huge knock on him. That's part of the reason that he barely contributed at the NBA level, but this is very concerning. We're on Fultz watch with Johnny Davis.
So it's funny you should mention that. That was actually one of my takeaways from that Magic game last night. I thought Fultz jumper looked pretty good.
It does.
I still don't trust him from deep, but his mid-range jumper looks a little bit more like it looked when he played at Washington.
A little bit. You're right. It gets better every year. There's still something off-putting about it that makes you kind of cringe when you watch it.
It's just not as hitchy as it was a couple of years ago.
The hitch is gone, but it's still the ball stays on his hand way too long. It doesn't leave his hand until his arm is fully released. I don't know. This is way too deep analysis of a guy who shoots the ball way better than we do, but it's still a little off. But either way, Johnny Davis, I assume they're trying to reconfigure his jump shot this offseason. It did not look good.
Well, he won't get a lot of opportunities if he ever sees the floor with Jordan Poole, because that guy is about to jack up more shots than you've ever seen in your entire life in the regular season. He's got that sort of opportunity now to be the focal point of an offense or a team that they have no idea what they are. I still can't figure out, and I've been trying to figure this out for a decade, what the Wizards' identity is. And I think they're only getting further away from answering that question as every year passes.
I think you're right. Although they finally embraced a rebuild, right? Or at least somewhat of a rebuild. This to me, if you're a Wizards fan, what you have going right now is better than what was going for the last 3 to 5 years, especially. Basically, once it became clear that John Wall was just never going to be that guy anymore, you're still trying to cling to winning 38 games with Bradley Beal and Otto Porter, and they were just so resistant to actually trying to rebuild. You're picking 14th in the draft every year. That's how you get guys like Corey Kispert, Johnny Davis. I think they at least have a direction. You have players who you could flip at the deadline. You don't really have any major long-term commitments on this roster. I think it's okay it's okay to be a bottom 3 team. You'd rather win 19 games and be in the mix for the number 1 pick than, win 31 games and be picking 9th to 15th every year.
Absolutely. And they just need to figure out who, what kind of team they want to be, but it all starts with bottoming out and working your way up from there. I just think there's a lot of duplication on this roster right now, but you're right. I mean, at least they know they want to be bad for the first time in a while, and they're not okay with just being middle of the road, which is okay here and there in the NBA, but once you get stuck in the middle, it's hard to get out.
Saw some Emoni Bates clips last night. Played 14 minutes off the bench for the Cavs. Looked okay. 10 points, hit a couple of threes. Just kind of up to his usual tricks. He's kind of like Cam Thomas in a lot of ways. Like he doesn't see defenders. He's just kind of out there doing his own thing. And if there happens to be someone standing in front of him, it doesn't really matter. Is this going to be a thing in the regular season? Like, are we going to be having conversations about whether or not you should pick up Emoni Bates off waivers? Or do you see this as a situation where he's, back and forth from the G League, not really contributing in year one?
Yeah, I think it'll probably be more of a back and forth situation. They just have such a good idea of what their rotation wants to look like. And now even more so as they add Max Strus in the offseason. Cleveland, talk about a team that doesn't lack or doesn't have an identity crisis. They know exactly what they want to be. They know who they want their contributors to be. And their starters are going to play heavy minutes because they've got a lot of guys that can handle the ball.
Yeah, I don't really see this being something where he's making a huge impact. I mean, especially because they brought in Max Strus and Georges Niang, who in theory do a lot of what Emoni Bates is doing, which is kind of, spot up 3-point shooting, microwave scoring.
Yeah.
I think at best he's like, seeing minutes as like the 9th man. And, defensively, he's going to be a huge liability. He probably needs to gain like 15 to 20 pounds to have any chance defensively. I mean, I don't know what they list him at, but he's like, 6'9", 6'10", 170, if that. So I do think this ends up being kind of a training wheels year for Emoni Bates. I want to go to the Houston Rockets game. They were playing the Indiana Pacers. First of all, Ben Mathurin making a second straight start with Buddy Hield coming off the bench. Not a great night for Buddy Hield. He goes 2 of 10 from the field. We'll keep monitoring that situation throughout the preseason. We'll keep monitoring whether or not Indiana advances any trade talks for Buddy Hield. But interesting nonetheless to see Ben Mathurin in the starting lineup. Alex on Monday was all over this. Like he thought this was a great decision. He's very, very high on Ben Mathurin. I like what I saw from him last year. I also think there's a case to be made that he's kind of the perfect 6 man.
Yeah, but if they're going to move off of Buddy Hield, they need to get Ben Mathurin ready for that spot. So that's where I agree with Alex on that front. In a perfect situation, Ben Mathurin was one of the best 6 men in the NBA as a rookie. So it's hard to kind of argue at that point, but moving forward, they need him to advance from 6-man status to maybe the best player on the team. They need him to be the star moving forward for this franchise. They're going to be an interesting team to watch this year. They were at 35 wins last season, and I kind of like the way they're building, but it usually is in Indiana. It's a slow build. But it all starts with Ben Mathurin, and he's got to play heavy minutes in order to really make an impact.
Yeah, I think he's a player that was much better in real life than in fantasy last year. As is the case with a lot of rookies, the percentages started to tail off toward the end of the season, and didn't add a ton defensively. Really not a guy who's interested in passing all that much. Although I think it's there. Like I don't think he has like no passing vision. I think he's just, his job for this team is to come in and score the basketball. So he's kind of a points, threes, a couple of rebounds type of guy for fantasy. So I think his real life value right now exceeds what he's probably going to give you in most fantasy leagues. On the Houston side of things, I am so intrigued by this roster. I have no idea how many games the Rockets are going to win. Their win total is 31.5 at DraftKings and FanDuel. Maybe we'll talk about them in a bit when we give out our favorite win totals. Like I could kind of see this team winning 35 plus games. I could also see it being a disaster where there are almost too many mouths to feed. I think it's a really interesting spot for Fred VanVleet, joining this team as a veteran, a guy who's won a title, a guy who's been in the playoffs, competing for titles just about every year. And now you're throwing him in with this group that's really accomplished nothing. But with that said, I'm very high on Jabari Smith as a second-year breakout. I love Alperen Sengun. He had a big night last night. Still think that Jalen Green can absolutely be salvaged. It's hard to just come in and be a 20-plus point per game player in year 2. I think people are a little bit too down on Jalen Green. And then, Ahmed Thompson, Cam Whitmore, Jayshawn Tate. I mean, there are like 8 guys that I really want to see, have real roles for this team, and it's just not going to be possible.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have a lot of guys that are just learning how to play in the NBA. Right. So I doubt that if I had to pick, that was one that I was looking at when I was trying to decide my favorite over-unders. That one, it feels dangerous taking the under because they've got a lot of talent. So you could see them sliding over that very low total. But I just don't see how defensively they hold up throughout the course of the season. They're going to have some games where they absolutely take out some heavy hitters because they're just going to have 3 or 4 guys that get red hot from the field. But I don't think this is a team that's gonna accomplish much this year outside of figuring out who are the pillar pieces that you want to build around. But they just simply have too many guys that are still trying to figure out this league. It's a lot on Fred VanVleet's shoulders. They'll go as he leads them. So if he has a great season, I think they'll come together quicker than maybe I'm giving them credit for.
We should know Dillon Brooks was ejected from this game for a flagrant 2. That is less than 6 minutes into his Houston Rockets debut. I believe it was Daniel Tice who he caught with an elbow to the groin area. So Dillon Brooks just kind of business as usual, picking up where he left off.
They have to be regretting that decision already.
This is what you signed up for, right? I don't know. I mean, if
5 minutes in.
Yes. If you didn't expect him to get kicked out of the preseason opener, I don't know what else you're bringing in Dillon Brooks for. Cam Whitmore, 17 minutes off the bench, 15 points in 17 minutes, had a huge dunk off of a nice pass from Şengün, nice cut by Whitmore in the first half. How much should we see of him? Like I'm of the belief that he's going to be in the rotation. I also think if you look at his numbers, in high school, if you look at his numbers, especially at Villanova last year, I don't know that there's going to be a ton of translatable fantasy value right away. I think he'll be a points and okay rebounds guy. There's not a whole lot else there in his stat profile.
No, that's the issue with Houston. They have a couple of guys like that are really good at scoring the basketball, but what else are you bringing to the table? You've got to do more than that in the NBA. But I think Cam Whitmore is somebody that I actually took him the other day, last pick in the draft. Let's just see what we get because he's got so much talent, jumps out of the gym. He's a guy that I think Ime Udoka is going to have a really hard time leaving him off the floor. So I'm intrigued, but keep your expectations at a proper level.
All right, before we talk NBA win total bets, we got a message from our good pals at Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is the #1 platform for best ball leagues, including fantasy basketball. Underdog's featured best ball tournament for the upcoming NBA season carries $500,000. That's $500,000, Brandon, in total prizes. If you have not tried Underdog yet, new Underdog users receive a first-time deposit bonus of up to $100, as well as a free 6-month subscription to RotoWire. All you got to do is use our promo code. That's RWNFL. Again, that promo code is RWNFL. Visit UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app today and use that promo code RWNFL to claim your free RotoWire subscription, as well as that deposit bonus, again, up to $100 and essentially free money to use on Underdog. All right, Brandon, we talked yesterday. We said we're each coming up with our 3 favorite NBA win total bets. They could be overs, they could be unders. We could discuss some of the other ones that were in consideration, but let's get right to it. Give me your favorite NBA win total bet for the 2023-24 season.
I would throw #1, top of the list, the Atlanta Hawks under 41.5 wins this year. I do not have a lot of confidence that this team's going to be better than they were a year ago, and I think the teams beneath them are improving. Trae Young is always a candidate to get dealt. He'll be a part of that conversation for forever, and he's a candidate to miss time. Both of those make me not like Atlanta and not want to put a futures bet on them to hit that over. They won 41 last year. Just not a lot of optimism for me. I feel like the Hawks are who they are. They're the Dallas Cowboys of the NBA. They're going to lull us into a false sense of security at some point in the season, and then we'll get whapped in the back of the head with reality.
I actually kind of like that comp. Like I think there is some like Trae Young, Dak Prescott parallels here that if we really wanted to dive into, maybe we'll have to save that for the XM show one of these nights. But
yeah, big star, not translatable to winning championships.
Exactly. No, I think you make some good points. I mean, this team lost John Collins, and I think the Hawks would tell you, like, who cares? He hasn't, he's kind of fallen off. But I actually think John Collins is a very good player. I think he just did not fit whatsoever with this new core for the Atlanta Hawks. I think Trae Young is a very difficult player for someone who's somewhat passive like John Collins to try to fit around. And it just felt like, 2-3 years ago, we knew the fit wasn't good, and it just continued to degrade every season. So I do think that's a relatively sizable loss. I mean, that's 30 productive minutes per game that are just out of your rotation. And you have AJ Griffin, you got Sadiq Bey, you got Jalen Johnson. In theory, there's some players to backfill John Collins, but you didn't really make any notable additions, right? Like I don't think Kobe Buffkin is going to be the guy that moves Atlanta from a 40-win team to a 45-win team this season. I still think this team has a reasonable floor, but when you're looking at the win total numbers, you said 41.5. You can actually get it at 42.5 at DraftKings. So even better there. This one was on my honorable mention list. So I agree with you. I think Atlanta is just, they're the new Wizards in some ways. And you could say that Trae Young is still, a solid young asset. If they ever were to trade him, there will be teams lining up to get him. That's someone you could cash in on. Same with DeJounte Murray, who's still relatively young. But this team is perfectly built to be somewhere between like the 6 and the 9 seed in the East.
And perfect example of why you should shop around, because I got my line from FanDuel Sportsbook, and that's at 41.5. So if you also agree and want the under, go ahead and buy yourself an extra victory by going over to DraftKings.
All right, I'm going to go with the New Orleans Pelicans over 44.5 as my first one here. I would like to get this number just a little bit lower for a team that won 42 games a year ago. But, I think in some ways last year was a close to worst case scenario as far as Zion's health, as far as CJ McCollum, having a down year until picking it up later on. Some of the other injuries on this roster, you're missing some of your depth. They're now going to be without Trey Murphy to begin the year. We'll see how much that ultimately impacts this team. But, they had injuries all over the place, still got to 42 wins. This was a team, Brandon, we forget, 26 games into the year, like basically at Christmas last year, they were 18-8. They were leading the Western Conference. I mean, even at one point they were 23-12. And then they had that terrible month of January. I think they lost like 11 or 12 games in a row. And they went from being 12, 13 games over 500 to an under 500 team essentially overnight. And then from then on, it was just kind of one step forward, 2 steps back after the All-Star break. So, of course, a lot of this does hinge on the health of Zion Williamson, but Zion gave them almost nothing last year. And, this is still a team that won 42 games. So I'm pretty high on the Pelicans. I think this is one of the friendlier numbers. These win totals, in my opinion, get sharper every single year. There's very few that you look at and say, oh man, this is a total lock. We're getting huge value here. I think the books know what they're doing. But if Zion Williamson gives you 50 games, 55 games, I think the Pelicans cruise over.
Yeah, my only concern with that is that you are banking on the easy lock to hit the over is for Zion to be available for over 50% of the season, and that's just so hard to bank on. But this was a team last year. How much should you change your perception of what you thought the Pelicans were going into last season versus what they are going into this season when they're not really all that different? I thought the Pelicans were going to be the top seed in the West. That's how confident I was last year. So obviously going out on a limb here in making that prediction, but I was like you. I believed a lot in that basketball team. It all comes down to health. But if you are of the opinion that they are one of those contenders in the West, you're getting quite the fair price with the number that Nick just laid out.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I'll say about the Pels too is they're in that basket of kind of secondary teams in the West. And you could say the same thing about some teams in the East as well, where it means a lot to the Pelicans to win games. Like getting not even the 1 seed, but like the 2 or the 3 seed would be massive for this team. Right. Whereas, you look at Denver, I don't think they really care. Even Memphis at this point, they haven't had the playoff success, but they've been a top 2, 3 seed for a few years now. The blueprint is kind of what we saw with Sacramento last year, right? Where like, the Kings were pushing harder than anybody during the regular season because they just have not had that kind of success. And it means more to that franchise to win 48 games than it means to the Phoenix Suns or the LA Clippers or the LA Lakers. So that's kind of the blueprint that I think you're following if you're the Pelicans.
Yeah, you definitely want to target those teams that just simply care more about the regular season. Moving on to my second team, I would take the Nets under 37.5 wins. Unless Mikal Bridges becomes a top 10 player in this league, which is possible. I mean, he's a really good He's a really good player, all NBA
Mhm.
type of guy. I don't see how they surpass that win total, though. They get to 45 last year. That was with Kevin Durant playing a number of games for them most of the season. The roster is bleak, and I just thought that they played way above their heads a year ago. So I
Mhm.
would go under on the Nets.
Yeah, I like that one as well. This number just feels a little bit too high. I'm surprised that it's not, I would say, 2 or 3 wins lower. And we know about the McCall Bridges hype in fantasy, but I guess I didn't know that that extended to the betting market because on paper, like I love McCall Bridges. I just think until the second half of last season, we were always thinking about him as like a third option. Kind of this like supercharged Tobias Harris type of guy. And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, could he be, is this guy going to be like a future all-star? Like, can he be the number one guy? I don't like the depth on this team at all. Like the starting five, Ben Simmons, Dinwiddie, Bridges, Johnson, Claxton, like that's not bad. We'll get to Ben Simmons in a moment, but beyond that, I mean, there are very few proven options. You like Darius Baisley is like your backup forward. You got guys like Royce O'Neal, Lonnie Walker, like just kind of some bit players, but to me, this is not a team that stacks up to approaching 40 wins. I think they're probably in the low to mid 30s for me. And a lot of this is kind of depending on Ben Simmons to be competent, available, willing to shoot the ball. And he looked okay the other night against the Lakers. Certainly looked better than he had at any point last season. But much like you just laid out with Zion, there's nothing is guaranteed with Ben Simmons.
No. I mean, yeah, I just can't put my faith into him giving us anything, whether it's on the court or if he's not able to play. Those are the type of situations that I'm happy to fade. And you laid out the roster. There are some nice players on that team, and that's where I thought in terms of they could go on a brief run and play over their heads. They already did that. That happened last season. Am I really going to believe that they're going to be able to do that year over year? They don't have that kind of talent. So that's where if Mikal Bridges turns into a guy where we go, oh my God, this is one of the league's best players, that is their only chance. Or Ben Simmons becoming someone that you can trust. And both of those feel like they're far less likely to happen than I would want to put my money on.
All right, I got a few more that I'm kind of choosing between here. I'm over prepared as I typically do here, and then I'm like, oh, I'll just decide on the fly, which usually doesn't make for great podcasting.
Oh, give us the decision making process over there. Who you?
Well, I don't want to reveal too much. I mean, I got like 4 of them written down. I can only choose 2. All right, we're going with this one first. Over 44.5 for the Knicks. Over 44.5. That's the number at DraftKings. It's 45.5 at FanDuel. Again, make sure you're shopping around. Get the best number when it comes to win totals. That is huge. Knicks won 47 a year ago. They're basically running it back. I think this is a team that also has the flexibility to eventually make a move if they wanted to, and if the right player becomes available. I think they're a team that could get better at the trade deadline, before the trade deadline, depending on who may shake loose. But this is also much like the Pelicans to me, Brandon. There's less risk here because there's not this Zion factor hanging over everything. But the Knicks are a regular season juggernaut. Like this is a team that's built to win games in the regular season. It's a team that wants to win games in the regular season. And I don't view the Knicks as any sort of real contender. They're like, best case to me is they catch a break in the playoffs and like make the Eastern Conference Finals and lose to Boston or lose to Milwaukee in 4 games. But this is a really good roster that has depth just about everywhere. I really like their guard depth. You bring in Dante DiVincenzo to add to Quentin Grimes, Emmanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett, Jalen Brunson. They still have some question marks. I think if Julius Randle were to go down at any point, that would be an issue. There's really not a natural replacement for him. But part of the reason that we love Julius Randle in fantasy, and he can be a little polarizing as a real life player, but he's played 77, 72, 71, 64, 73, 82, 74, 81 games throughout his career since suffering that leg injury. Like I think it was the first game of his NBA career with the Lakers. Like he's been as durable as it gets as far as all-star level players go. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these win totals. Like especially if you're betting it over, you want to be betting a team that doesn't have 2 or 3 big time injury liabilities, and I don't think the Knicks do.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's exactly why you want to fade a team like the Nets, but that's why you love a team like New York, and they fit the bill perfectly for a team that cares a lot about regular season wins. They're built for that. I do think you're going to have to sweat that one, but I think you get the over, but I don't think it's going to be a cakewalk. You're going to need the last couple of weeks of the season to really secure that bag.
I'm just surprised this number isn't higher, right? Like typically you'll see teams
Yeah.
like the Knicks and the Lakers, the win totals will be like 2 or 3 wins higher just because there's such a public market. So I don't know. I'm getting the Knicks at like 2.5 wins under what they had last year. I'll take it.
I think a discount version of what if you like the mentality that Nick laid out with the New York Knicks, I feel like you almost have to bet the over for the Chicago Bulls because they fit the bill in so many ways. This is a team that's built for the regular season. They're never going to be able to accomplish anything with the way their roster is constructed in the playoffs, but they've got guys that can win regular season games. And DeMar DeRozan has shown that he can go on stretches where he looks like the best mid-range scorer in the league. 37.5 is the win total there. They should be able to hit that. You're not feeling it.
So they won 40 a year ago. I wouldn't say I'm feeling it. I'm not feeling it, but I don't love it. My concern here is that, what if they get off to somewhat of a shaky start and there's DeMar DeRozan on an expiring contract, and it's pretty easy to make that calculation and say, all right, we got to get something for him now because we're probably not signing him again. So that's what really keeps me away from the Bulls. I think if you could tell me that DeMar DeRozan plays out the entire season on this roster, then yeah, I think I like the over here. I think you are getting a nice discount, but if they get off to a 9-14 start like they did last season, I think there's going to be some momentum to kind of lean into a rebuild, right? I mean, this is another team that's been in that wizard zone for the last few years where you have enough pieces where you can talk yourself into contending. Even the years when they made the playoffs, they've just gotten the doors blown off them, usually by Milwaukee. So I think this could be kind of an inflection point season for Chicago. And if they keep this roster together, yeah, they probably win 38, 39, 40 games. If they don't, I think they could go south.
Yeah, I guess what I'm banking on is that they're not going to have buyers at the deadline for the players they have. There's a reason they're stuck in the middle. It's because they've built their team around these guys. I mean, everybody's available and valuable at the right price. And they're, Zach LaVine, Vooch, and DeMar DeRozan, decent players, but are they the type of guys that are going to put you over the top? I just don't know if they probably will want to make that decision. I don't know if they're going to be able to. But yeah, okay. You've scared me off. That wasn't one of my favorite 3, by the way, so I don't want to sell you too hard on it. Can I give you my third one?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, we're going to go with a bottom-dwelling team. I like a nice low total that I can slide in with the over. Give me the Hornets. Over 30.5 wins. A healthy LaMelo Ball. A returning Miles Bridges. I like P.J. Washington. The potential of Brandon Miller to be a budding star early on for this team. I'm a firm believer of Steve Clifford getting guys to play above themselves. He didn't do it last year, but that was a mess of a situation he was dealing with health and suspensions. He's going to get these guys to commit to play some semblance of defense, just enough to where they can slide in over that total.
Well, and we'll see what they get back for Kai Jones, too, if they're able to trade him. I mean, that could be another huge boost to this roster. They won 27 a year ago. You're getting Miles Bridges back, which, I mean, he's kind of in like this Deshaun Watson zone where every time you talk about him, you have to be like, hey, not a good guy. But he's going to make a big impact for them on the court. Like he was a very good player 2 years ago, very good fantasy player as well. So I think to me, that's kind of the swing piece. Like I'm not expecting Brandon Miller to be a winning player. And Gordon Hayward at this point, like he's just like the Andy Dalton of the NBA, I guess. Like he's always hanging around. Like he'll have a couple nice games. Like he'll have like a 2-week stretch where he'll give you like 27, 5 and 5, and then he'll roll his ankle and be out for the next 2 months. There are names on this team. Like I worry a little bit about their depth at center, but you could always slide PJ Washington up there if you need to. But yeah,
this was a play-in team. This was a play-in team before they bottomed out last year. So I think that's more of who they are than what they showed last season. Well, we're killing it today. We're killing it with the football analogies today, by the way.
Yeah, right. 43 wins 2 years ago, and you forget. I mean, LaMelo. Obviously, if you played fantasy, this was hurting you, but only 36 games last year, and that's worst case. And both of those injuries, like he, has the ankle injury early on. And then I believe, didn't he tweak it, like stepping on the foot of a fan while trying to save a ball from going out of bounds? Like, I don't think we view LaMelo Ball as this like super injury prone player now. Like those to me were kind of isolated freak incidents.
I think so. And of course, if he gets hurt, but this is the case with any bet you make before the season. If the star players goes down, you're going to hate your bet. So you just have to kind of plug your nose and deal with it.
All right, my last one here. I'm deciding between two, and I will tell you that it is the Sixers under 49.5 and the Oklahoma City Thunder over 44.5. It's more fun to talk about overs. Let's go with OKC. I'm making
You're
that one
making the right
my
decision.
three-star.
That was one
44 and a
that
half.
was one that was on my chopping block, Nick.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of a jarring number for a team that it feels like for the last 5 years we've been conditioned to see their number at 27. But they got to 40 wins last year, 42 if I'm not mistaken, as I lose my basketball reference page here. But I think much like some of these other teams that we've talked about over, it's like there's incentive for this team to win games. Like I think they have not had success in a long time, and I think you want this young core developing winning habits as much as possible. And that's part of it as well. It's like you don't have a bunch of 34-year-olds that you're depending on to win games. Like I don't think this is going to be a team that's going out of its way to rest players like it had in years past. We saw SGA finally play close to a full season last year. Maybe we're a little concerned about that with Chet Holmgren, depending on what his workload is. But I thought he looked fantastic the other night going up against Wembanyama. I mean, that was impressive. I think the shooting looks even better than it did the last time we saw him at Summer League. Jalen Williams, one of my absolute favorite young players in the league. The primary concern for me with OKC is outside of the top five of Holmgren, Williams, Dort, Giddey, SGA. This is not a team that has depth at all, and that's been the case for the last couple of years. It's like if any of those guys miss significant time, I think they could be in trouble here because they're still filling out like their 6 through 10 spots with essentially like G League caliber guys.
Right. Yeah, I like it though. I mean, you talk about a team. What do we look for? We want teams that have quality, that possess the ability to be playoff teams, that are going to take the regular season seriously. OKC is too young and dumb, and I mean that as a compliment, to know better. They're not a team yet that's figured out that, well, we can coast during January and we'll still be okay. They're still trying to pile up wins. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is a full-blown superstar. You mentioned the Chet addition to this team. They won 40 games last year. They should be able to improve. They're clearly one of those teams that's on a very obvious upward trajectory. Mm-hmm. So I think I could see them pie in the sky. I think they could be a top 3 seed in the West this year because of their ability to kind of sprint from the start to the finish line in the regular season.
Yeah, that's what I was basically just going to say is like, if there's one of these that I feel like, I'm not going to be sweating out and, they could just smash this over, obviously it could go the other way too. It's not a given, but OKC could win like 51 games in a best case, right? Like if SGA is picking up where he left off last season, if Giddey and Jalen Williams take a step forward, if Chet Holmgren is as good as he looked the other night against Wembanyama, I mean, this is one where we could look back and say, wow, I can't believe this number was sitting at 44.5. All right, let's talk some ADP figures here, Brandon, and then we'll get out of here. I know you have a few player versus player matchups that you want to discuss. So
yes,
whenever you want, however many you want to get through, let's hit them.
So I'm going to tee up 2 players to Nick over here who have a similar position in terms of average draft position. I'm also going to pair 2 players together that play a similar position because what I'm going to remove from the equation is you go, well, it depends who's on my roster at this point. I wanted to remove that part from the equation. Okay. So we're going to start. I'm going to go with players that are towards the top of ADP and kind of work my way down. Steph Curry versus Tyrese Haliburton. Who are you drafting? Who are you leaving on the board?
Man, I think I'm going Haliburton here just because of the injury liability with Steph at this point. It's not quite Durant level where it feels like you're just penciling him in for like 20 to 25 missed games, but he's played 56, 64, 63, 5, 69, 51 over the last 6 seasons. I don't know that trend necessarily reverses as he plays his age 35 season. It's tough though, because Steph he's still a cheat code in terms of 3-pointers. Like if you're in a roto league, those threes are ultra valuable. I mean, it kind of controls the way you could build the rest of your roster. So I wouldn't say I'm staying away from Steph in the same way that I'm generally staying away from Durant just for injury purposes, but I got to go Haliburton there.
Well, in terms of average draft position, I just pulled up Fantasy Pros. They've got Steph Curry is the 7th overall pick, Tyrese Haliburton, right now going at 8. But you assume that that's because of name value. People want Steph on their fantasy roster. Let's give you a couple of big men to consider. Here's a guy that is now on 100% of my rosters, and I did not intend for this to be the case, but Victor Wembanyama, I apparently am higher on him than consensus. So we've got him or Minnesota Timberwolves center power forward Karl-Anthony Towns.
Well, first of all, no offense to the folks at Fantasy Pros, but I tell you what, RotoWire has a fantastic ADP page where you could compare. You get a composite figure, and then you can compare individual ADPs for ESPN, CBS, Yahoo, Underdog, Fantrax. So I want to steer any viewers or listeners over to that page. It's great. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback on it. Towns versus Wembanyama. Oh man, I've been burned on Towns so many times. Like he's had some great years. He's had some down years due to injury. I'm always timing the market wrong on Towns. Like every time I buy in, it's a bad year. Every time I pass, it's a good year. So I have to keep that in mind. I've also been like at cost. I don't think I'm going to get a lot of Wembanyama, and I think that cost is only going to rise. In light of how he looked the other night, in light of how we expect him to look for the rest of the preseason. Like I really worry about games played for Wembanyama. I think he's going to be fantastic. I think the blocks are going to be huge. We saw there was a play the other night where like he didn't even leave the ground. Like he just, kind of rebound, tipped in a missed free throw. And you kind of forget of like, oh yeah, he should be able to do that like all the time. Like I think things are going to be really easy for him. But I also think there's a world in which, the Spurs are really careful. He rolls his ankle at some point in the year and he ends up playing like 51 games. And at that point, if you drafted him 18th overall, which is where he's going in CBS leagues right now, I don't think you're going to get a return on value. So, not that Towns has been super healthy the last couple of years. He was such an Iron Man to begin his career. That's now completely out the window. But I think I would lean Karl-Anthony Towns because I ultimately am banking on him playing more games.
And Towns was a guy that was a former, was he like a number 1 overall pick not too long ago, of a guy that I think that he falls into this camp of players that you just sort of maybe bored with, and then that's how guys like Victor Wembanyama get pushed up the board because he's the shiny new toy. Let's move to number 3 here, Jalen Brunson of the New York Knicks, who burst onto the scene quite a bit last year as the focal point of that New York Knicks squad, or someone that you cannot trust at all, but is a stat stuffer when he's on the floor, James Harden. So Jalen Brunson, James Harden. Who you got?
Oh goodness. Oh man. This is a brutal matchup. I mean, these are like polar opposites, right? Like you have one of the safest players in fantasy in Jalen Brunson, one of the biggest wild cards of all time in James Harden. I tend to go conservative in these situations. I would lean Jalen Brunson. Certainly James Harden has the higher upside, no question about that. We have seen his average ADP plummet over the last week or so. By the way, I mean he's going after pick 40 on some host sites now. There's a certain point where I'm willing to take Harden because I think the thing that he has that Brunson doesn't is legit top 10 potential. Like whether it's in Philly, whether it's somewhere else, like if James Harden has even like a like B+ James Harden season, he's going to be a top 10 player. He's going to give you a ton of free throws, threes, assists. We know all that. Whereas with Brunson, if you're taking him at 35 and he finishes 32nd, like that's like a rousing success, right? So right. I do worry a little bit about the lack of true upside for Brunson, but he's just so safe. And if we're talking like end of the 3rd round, I'm going to side with the guy, who's played 68, 79, 68 games and is not currently, in like a very public battle with his own team.
So I am currently on the far superior site, RotoWire.com, and I am looking here at, are you surprised that James Harden is going about 5 slots higher than Jalen Brunson, just simply because don't we like the certainty in fantasy, or is the upside of James Harden just that enticing?
I think it's that enticing, dude. I think it is. So. And I think the fact that he at least reported to camp, has quelled some of the concerns. I mean, we have on all of our player pages at RotoWire, you could go and see where a player finished in fantasy every year of their career. And I'm looking at James Harden right now. Since he arrived in Houston to his final year at Houston, this is where he finished in total value. So this counts games played: 3rd, 5th, 1st, 2nd, 1st, 3rd, 1st. I mean, there are very few players have anything close to that kind of track record. Like Durant, kind of measures up in that way as well, but he's had some injuries. So I think there's this fear of, it's the Jonathan Taylor situation. It really is. Like, I think that's as close as it gets. Like, where, Jonathan Taylor 3 weeks ago, if you took him, 20th overall in your draft, you're looking like an idiot. You're thinking he's not going to play. He's still demanding a trade. All of a sudden he's back, and, only had 10 snaps last week, but eventually he's going to be the number one back. Like, I think there's that fear that if you pass on James Harden, especially in the 30s or the early 40s of your draft, that someone's basically getting a free ticket to a top 15 player.
Yeah. Does that make Tyrese Maxey Zach Moss, I guess? So we got to keep an eye on him as well.
Yes, I think it does.
All right, interesting conundrum, and that's going to be one that a lot of drafters face. Jamal Murray versus Jordan Poole. I find myself really intrigued by Jordan Poole in fantasy for many obvious reasons. I think he's going to have kind of free reign to do what he wants there. What do you say? Jamal Murray, Jordan Poole, who are you drafting if they're on the board?
Oh, that's a really, really good one. And in general, we're seeing Murray go a few picks higher than Jordan Poole. With Poole, it is somewhat dependent on your situation. Like, if you're in a points league, I think Jordan Poole is very, very appealing. Although he is a very good free throw shooter and should be taking more free throws. So, even if he shoots 42% from the field, if he's shooting 89% at the line and taking 7 a game, like that kind of balances out to me. I'm interested to see, what does Jordan Poole show as a passer? Because, even last year in Golden State, I think people were so down on him, especially by the time we got to the playoffs, that you kind of forget that he was a 20-point per game player, 4.5 assists, almost 1 steal per game. So now if you're adding 5 to 6 minutes per game, you're kind of increasing his time on the ball. Can he get to, 24, 6 assists, 3.5 rebounds, like 1.1 steals? If so, if you think that's his upside, then I would rather have Jordan Poole. It doesn't matter how many games you win. The concern, I guess, Brandon, and I'll ask you how concerned about this you are. We talked about Washington having a direction, that direction being down. Is there a concern that, we see what we've seen with other rebuilding teams in the past where, the last 10 to 15 games of the year, all of a sudden, Jordan Poole develops a phantom injury?
Yeah, and I think that has to be part of your consideration. And it almost feels like we're back to the same conversation with Jalen Brunson versus James Harden. I think I know exactly what I'm going to get from Jamal Murray. He's clearly past the injury issues. He is as steady a player as they get, and he should be a factor come the end of the season. Jordan Poole could be somebody that at his best in fantasy is the kind of guy that can win you a league, but you do have to worry about the end of the season. I'm more worried about collecting wins and then figuring it out later. So just my personal mindset going in is I don't really like to plan for what that last week in fantasy is going to look like because you just have no idea who's going to get you there, who's healthy and all of that. So I tend to lean Jordan Poole in that equation, but I'm happy with either guy. I'll hit you with a couple of other ones real quick. Evan Mobley versus Deandre Ayton. Who do you like there? Evan Mobley of the Cavs, of course, and Ayton now with the Portland Trailblazers.
Evan Mobley or DeAndre Ayton. So Mobley on average going about pick 45 across all those host sites that we mentioned. And, some of those skew more points leagues, some skew roto. So I think the composite actually gives you a pretty good indication of where guys are going. Ayton, 57.8 is his ADP. I like Mobley more as the player, right? I think most people would say that. I don't know that we're going to get that like huge year over year leap at any point. I think it's just one of those things where like 5 years from now, it'll just be kind of a gradual improvement to the point where he's, an all NBA guy. But I don't know if we get a huge leap this year, partially because they're kind of running it back. They added even more scoring, around Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell. He plays with another big man in Jared Allen. So in some ways, I think that limits his rebounding and his shot blocking upside. So I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think I would go DeAndre Ayton, especially if I could get him, 10 to 12 picks later. That would break the tie for me. How much do you worry about Robert Williams encroaching on Ayton's role? That would be the one drawback for me.
I think Ayton's going to be really involved. I think you made the right pick there. Evan Mobley, what he possesses more than anything else is the ability to defend the paint. And I think DeAndre Ayton's he fits the bill of what you want from a fantasy big man more so than Evan Mobley. So it's, I think there's more upside there. It seems like it wasn't even really necessarily the goal going in, but it's a lot of these questions turn into safety versus upside. And I think you just have to kind of balance your roster with a little bit of both, because you go too heavy in one direction, you can shoot yourself in the foot.
Well, it depends on shot blocking for Ayton too. Like if he's not blocking a shot per game, that's, that he's not going to finish in the top 50. Like that's a problem. That's where Mobley has a big edge. But Ayton's a better free throw shooter. He's like 10 percentage points better. So yeah, I think most people would just say Mobley right away, but I think that's actually a pretty good debate.
Two more for you. Walker Kessler, who blocked 1 million shots last year. And I mean, he clearly has carved out a very interesting role for himself with Utah, or a guy that is a potential rookie of the year candidate in Chet Holmgren.
Walker Kessler or Chet Holmgren. So Kessler's going about 58.7 on average. Holmgren, 55.2. I think that number is going to be on the rise. I don't want to read too far into one preseason game, man, but I'm enamored with Chet Holmgren. I think OKC has essentially ignored the center position for like 4 years now, and he's just the perfect fit. I think that the 3-point shooting is going to be huge for him. The shot blocking upside is going to be there. I do worry about games played with him. I do worry about the foot holding up. Big man coming off of foot surgery before even playing in the NBA, like that's just some pretty seriously bad vibes. So I think that's something where we need to see him make it through a full season before we fully buy in. Oh man, this is so tough. After all the nice things I said about Chet, I think I might go Walker Kessler just because I want the blocks. Right. I think there's certainly more upside with Holmgren, no question about it. I think he's a far more advanced offensive player. I think in terms of rebounding, they're comparable, and in terms of shot blocking, they could be comparable. But I think Walker Kessler, once he settled into a high minute role, an every night starting role, was as dependable as they come as far as getting those blocks. So if I'm in a roto league, especially, I think I'd probably lead Kessler. Though my guess is that most listeners would say Holmgren without much question.
Yeah, that's one we need to throw out there. See how social media reacts to that one. But Chet Holmgren, I'm just so intrigued by what he can do across the board. I would have a hard time leaving him on the board there. Let's wrap with two guys that profile as very similar players and are at complete opposite ends of their career. Scoot Henderson, the first-round pick for the Portland Trailblazers right now, average draft position 77th overall, versus Russell Westbrook of the Clippers, who's going 11 spots later. But, I mean, he's Russell Westbrook. So what do you do there? Scoot and Russ on the board at the same time.
Oh, man. This is a great one to end on. I can't – I wouldn't want to draft either of these guys, honestly. I'm not a Russ guy. As a semi LeBron supporter, I wasn't a Russ fan before he came to the Lakers, but that was the final nail in the coffin for me with him. But you got to respect what he did in the postseason, right? I mean, I'm not going to say that Russ was not fantastic. In that first round series for the Clippers. I don't know that I'm willing to just say that suddenly because of like how he played over 5 games that he's just back to being the guy that he was at age 30. I think ultimately he's still the very clear number 3 option on a lot of nights, although, we expect Paul George and Kawhi Leonard to miss time. Scoot is so tough because I really like the player. There's just, there is just almost no track record of like small point guards, like being great in fantasy right away. It's like field goal percentage is always an issue. Defensive production tends to be an issue as well. Like the 3-point shooting with Scoot's a big question mark. So I think I would have to go Westbrook here by default, just because we know the counting stats are for sure going to be there. And with Scoot, he's still, to me, like he's going to have the ball in his hands a ton, but there's a case to be made that he's like 3rd or 4th in the overall pecking order. Like Anthony Simons is still the number 1 dude. Jeremy Grant is kind of the co-number 1. DeAndre Ayton's not somebody that demands the ball, but he's going to get his touches. You're trying to develop Shaedon Sharpe as well. Malcolm Brogdon is still on this roster and might play for them at the beginning of the year. So there's obviously long-term, you want Scoot Henderson, no question, but I think I would give slight lean to Westbrook here.
Yeah. I was like, I think most that follow this stuff after the draft, I was like, projecting forward and looking at a Damian Lillard trade, I'm like to the moon for Scoot Henderson. But the closer we get to the season, the more you realize efficiency is going to be a major issue for this guy. So Russell Westbrook, I mean, steady Eddie in terms of, and he's always going to get his. So he's been doing it a little bit longer, and that's definitely the kind of guy I'm happy to have Russ on my roster. I think I've already overdrafted Scoot, and I'm willing to sort of cut that off.
Yeah, I mean, in a points league, Russ is ultimately fine. I just, I kind of have some like moral things that I need to work through when it comes to Westbrook. But we will discuss that another time, Brandon. We got to get out of here. We got some meetings coming up. We actually have the RotoWire Stake League auction this afternoon. So I will be, kind of multitasking, trying to avoid staying out of the basement there. This is a league where the top half of the league is safe. The bottom half of the league has to buy a very expensive steak dinner for the top half of the league. So obviously you want to win the league, but the bigger thing is you want to be in that top 8. It's a 16-team league. So looking forward to that auction. Alex Barutho will be in that as well. Shannon McCune, Ken Kreitz. So they'll have the full recap for that on the Friday episode of this podcast. Tomorrow will be Rick Kamla and Steve Dr. A. Alexander. You can check them out right here on Twitter, on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. For Brandon Kravitz, I'm Nick Whalen. We'll talk to you next week.